Oh, hi. Hello, nerds. It's me again. This is Let's Talk About Myths, baby, and I am that host of yours, she who officially has realized her limitations on narrative storytelling, Liv. And those limitations are Aristophanes. I will be honest with you, I am not proud of that series of episodes we just finished. If I could go back and cover something else, I would. But I am very glad that I managed to get the two guests that I have spoken to for this series, independent scholar Julie Levy last week, and associate professor at Trent University George Kovacs today. Between these two, they actually make Aristophanes an interesting person to read about, and a playwright whose plays are worth reading and studying. Thankfully, because gods know I was not making that case by myself. In today's episode, George and I talked about all things Aristophanes and the Thesmophoriazusae. We talked about gender dynamics and politics in ancient Athens. We talked more about that historical and political context that drives this play and everything within it. We talked about Aristophanes as a person, his style and intentions, and so much more. I could not have found a better guest to make the case for Aristophanes and this play, so I really cannot wait for you all to hear this episode. Gods know I don't have enough good things to say on my own, so let's get right into this fascinating look at why the Thesmophoriazusae is interesting and important, actually. Conversations. I guess Aristophanes is worth reading, after all. Redeeming the Thesmophoriazusae with George Kovacs. So, as the listeners heard last week, I'm not an enormous fan of this play. I'm glad I covered it because I'm glad I now know what the story is, but I definitely was not prepared for exactly how Aristophanes was going about talking about women specifically in this play, and then also
that's right, yeah.
Yeah, so what, like, why, what's kind of your connection to this play? You volunteered to come on, and thank you for that. So what's sort of your story with Thesmophoriazusae?
I've got a pretty long history with this play, actually. So right now I read it with a couple of my classes here at Trent. I've got a course on comedy in the ancient world, which I'm going through right now. And so that's why when you were tweeting about it, it was like I had just worked through the play yet again. And in that course, we look at the nature of comedy and is this actually funny? And do we still want to read things from antiquity when we don't find them funny anymore? And we spend a lot of time thinking about Euripides, right? So Aristophanes kind of has this obsession with Greek tragedy that, if you've talked about frogs before, you've seen in action. But this is the second of the three Euripides cameos that Aristophanes has in his sort of oeuvre, right? And the other the other course that I read this with is my Love, Sex, and Death in the Ancient World course. And that class is cross-listed with the department, formerly the Department of Gender and Women's Studies, and now it's the Department of Gender and Social Justice. So that really kind of pushes us in some very interesting directions. And when we read the play there, we think about it in terms of the treatment of basically all of the non-cis het male characters. So not only the treatment of the women, but of Agathon and Cleisthenes, right?
Yeah.
I've been working with this play a long time. I'll tell you, because I'm very confident there's no video evidence, I performed in a production of it in the year 2000 here at Trent. I played Nasilicus, the kinsman, in that production. And, so yeah, I come back to it a lot. And it's a play that I think everything about Aristophanes changes over time. One thing about comedy is that it changes more quickly than almost anything else from antiquity. I can teach my courses on Greek tragedy, and I can use translations from the 1950s if I have to. And they're still pretty consistent with what we do today. Translations of comedy tend to go stale very quickly. And I find the attitudes with which even I'm reading the plays has changed considerably, in the 25 years that I've been doing this. And, it's like almost every 2 to 3 years, I have a completely new cohort of students who are thinking about how comedy works in really different ways. Right. So yeah, that's my history of with this particular play. Yeah.
Well, I'm even more excited to have this conversation then, because it sounds like you've got kind of exactly what I want to talk about even more, which is that, I mean, I kind of knew what I was getting into because I knew it was an Aristophanes play, at a women's festival, and that there was going to be, men disguising themselves, in order to get in. But I was not expecting things like the character of Agathon and Cleisthenes and what that means both in the ancient world and today. And it added a whole other level of like both fascination, but also like a bit of just kind of like me wondering how on earth I should be talking about this, in relation to keeping it contextual with the ancient world, and also being like, well, I'm also in 2023 and I am a show that is deeply conscious of gender and gender, representation and everything like that. So it was unexpected getting into that. So I'd love to hear anything about those two characters. And really anything about this play broadly, but they really are the characters that really both fascinated me most and were the sort of the hardest for me to kind of wrap my head around in terms of how to present them in a narrative form like I do.
Yeah, fair enough. Cleisthenes, in a sense, he's a little bit easier to deal with in some ways because he's a running joke for Aristophanes. We don't know quite what it is about him, but we're told explicitly in the play he's the only male who's allowed to enter the women's only festival of the Thesmophoria. He seems unable to be able to grow a beard. That seems to be what the problem is for him. And that for Aristophanes, that makes him the butt of jokes because it makes him womanly. It makes him, not masculine. So we have other places where he's mocked in Aristophanes, in Lysistrata, for example, when the men are all, sort of separated from their wives. You get a one-liner like, the men are so desperate, even Cleisthenes is starting to look good. And even in Frogs, there's a reference to him, I believe, if I recall correctly, where they're still making fun of him. But he's a one-note joke. Like it's just, you mentioned Cleisthenes, and it's that he's not manly and that he is sexually submissive. And I don't think we actually have any corroborating evidence for Cleisthenes' personality or his sexual preferences, but because he doesn't have a beard, there it is. Agathon is, in some ways, more complex as a character for a couple of reasons. A, we know more about him. We can say more about him. I don't know if you've ever talked about Plato's Symposium on your podcast. But
far too long ago now. But
yeah. But Agathon appears as a character in that dialogue. And in fact, Plato's Symposium is set at Agathon's house after he's won his victory in the year 416, I think, if I recall correctly. And so he's kind of the host for this discussion of love. And he's there with his sexual partner, is another one of the speakers there. So we actually do have evidence of a relationship there. But then, what makes it even more complex is that he's a tragic poet. And one of the things that Aristophanes does extraordinarily well in this play is he kind of smashes together these two separate issues. One is, the issue of gender and the man versus woman, sort of competition that's told entirely from, the masculine point of view, right? Like there's no one's mistaking this for a play that's written by or for the women.
Yeah.
I think. But the same thing is going on with tragedy and comedy. So Aristophanes, as a comic poet, he loves tragedy. I think we can say that with some confidence. The level at which he's able to engage with Greek tragedy, and like he's able to quote lines, and he's able to really cleverly recontextualize quotations and passages. And indeed, right, the second half of this play has that sequence of 4 tragic parodies that are really well done.
Mm-hmm.
But he's also got a bit of a chip on his shoulder that tragedy is considered the senior sibling, or the more prestigious of the 2 art forms. And so he's kind of always ready to chip away at the superiority of tragedy, and sort of assert, comedy as something that is at least equal, if not better. And so when we get Agathon, who's portrayed in this kind of sexually submissive, gender ambiguous manner, we really have this kind of fusion of the man woman debate that's going on in one half of the play, but also the play of genre of tragedy and comedy. No, I'm not the originator of this theory, I should say. There's a very influential article by Froma Zeitling called Travesties of Gender and Genre. It's a very long, very complex article. But she does an amazing job of presenting, how these 2 seemingly very different threads are kind of brought together throughout the play.
That is, I mean, this is exactly the context I wanted. So thank you. This is it's gonna be the perfect additional episode. But it's so interesting to look at these characters, and from my perspective of how I handle at least my narrative episodes, and this is why I'm also so grateful that I get to have conversations now on the show, because it adds so much more. But on my end, I'm telling these plays and stories, and tragedy is considerably easier to tell in the form that I do. I'm increasingly realizing how difficult it is to do comedy in this way, and that I'm doing a 1-person show kind of thing, trying to explain these plays. And the thing about comedy is that, I mean, not only is it more difficult to express like the type of jokes that they use, like in the form that I do, but also it is so ingrained in the contemporary time. Like, you have to do all these things, like explain who Agathon is and Cleisthenes, and how Aristophanes feels about them. And I mean, then of course the Euripides, and, using Euripides as a character while reminding my audience that this is Aristophanes' fictional version of Euripides. And it's obviously considerably, or it's quite interesting in that respect, but so difficult, to portray in any kind of like coherent way. But it's interesting to think about also, like you're saying, that, the way that Aristophanes is commenting on tragedy as a genre within his play, while also commenting on women and gender broadly. And I'm so curious kind of, how, I mean, it's difficult. Obviously, it's kind of impossible to say what he was kind of trying to convey with these characters. Like, obviously, he is kind of using Cleisthenes as this one-liner, like you're saying, especially because I'm glad you mentioned the Lysistrata and was it Frogs also, that he's in both, and
where Euripides appears?
No,
Cleisthenes. Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Yeah, and I covered both of those so long ago now that I had not even remembered the name. So it's interesting to have that kind of connection.
And they are just one-liners in both Lysistrata and Frogs. This is the only time we get the cameo. So, he's, I guess, more than a one-liner here, but it's all about, this is a masked theater tradition. So it's a caricature mask, right? It's going to look ridiculous in some way. And Aristophanes clearly thinks he's going to get big laughs if he brings, a beardless Cleisthenes mask on stage.
Yeah, that's so interesting, and that brings up like the idea of comedy broadly, especially in the ancient world comparatively today. So, I mean, I don't know how much we want to jump around, and so if you have more kind of to talk about when it comes to the Agathon and Cleisthenes of it all, please feel free. But I'm curious
Yep.
then, because you were mentioning that you also talk about, or in your class, you talk about when, how to navigate something where it was hilarious in the past, and while there are funny parts of this play, there are other plays of his where the comedy still shines in a way that this one really doesn't age all of that well, but it is of course still interesting to study. So I'm so curious about that whole aspect.
No, I think that's right. And, what you were saying earlier about just how deeply contextual or embedded in his own time Aristophanes is exactly right. So again, like this, I'm teaching this comedy course right now. And for the first 4 or 5 weeks, I'm just constantly behind my lecture schedule because it's, like you say, it's just joke after joke, scenario after scenario that has to be explained in some way. We're off into new comedy now, which is about 100 years or 120 years after Aristophanes, depending on how you measure it. And there it's easy. Like we know a little bit about Menander, the comic poet, but we don't need to know much. Here's a family that lives just outside of Athens. This guy hates everybody and has divorced his wife and he's estranged from his son, and things are gonna happen that bring them all back together. Right. And that's kind of all the context that you really, really need to make sense of it. And you're right about this play too. I mean, there's some of the plays of Aristophanes are very challenging because of the way that, our changing value sets have, kind of overwrite what's there. Right. So with this play, the treatment of the women is very difficult to sort of reconcile with modern sensibilities, where there are other plays where you can read that don't have that same engagement, or where they are engaged are in ways that are sort of so critically distant from us that it's not going to affect us in quite so immediate a way, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I didn't think about comparing it to the frogs because it was fun to cover the frogs because it was mostly just kind of silly and mostly playing with tragedy more than anything, which is obviously is, it doesn't contain the same issues. So even if there were like maybe a handful of jokes, and it's been like 2 years since I covered it, but it's a very different thing. And also you just have the inherent nature of like frogs singing in the underworld is funny. Like that's just great. It makes it so much easier. It's just silly. Whereas, this one, I was interested in it primarily because of the Women's Festival and then Euripides, like I was saying, because I absolutely love Euripides and I love him and defend him explicitly because of his use of women. So I was really interested in looking at, what kind of the complaints are through Aristophanes. And that I think in itself is a fascinating thing, but maybe we want to talk about that a little bit later. But how he covers the women and then trying to navigate the like figuring out what level of the stereotypes and jokes that he's playing with are Aristophanes versus like the culture at the time, or completely, overblown intentionally, is really interesting and difficult to look at.
Yeah. And, one funny thing about this play, given the way that we're talking about it and looking at it, this is actually the safe material for Aristophanes in some ways, right? So I know you've already had a couple of episodes, that you'll have talked about this, and maybe you've got a little bit of historical context, but, Aristophanes' career, most of it plays out against the Peloponnesian War, which is this big, long sort of sequence of conflicts with the city of Sparta. And quite recently, for this play, they've had a truce as part of the conflict, but Athens has sent an expedition to Sicily, and they're going to try and conquer Sicily during this period of truce. And that Sicily is just too close to Sparta. It completely reignites the war, and it's an absolute disaster. They basically send all of their ships, and all of their ships are destroyed. And they get this news in 413, and so 412. It's an extraordinarily politically fraught time in Athens, so much so that we actually have an oligarchic coup in the offing. It's about 6 weeks after this play is produced. The democracy is overthrown, right? This so-called oligarchy of the 400. So Aristophanes, who for the first decade or so of his career is extraordinarily politically engaged, and he critiques, politicians of his day. He makes fun of the city for some of its policies. He's very, sort of vocal about the nature of the Peloponnesian War. When he gets to 411, things change, right? So he writes the first two plays that feature women in power. So he does Lysistrata, which is an anti-war play. And for that reason, we think he produces it at the festival known as the Lanaya, because that's a bit smaller. There are fewer visiting dignitaries. It's kind of more exclusively Athenian, right?
Mm-hmm.
You don't have any visitors, to watch this thing. But even there, the central figure is Lysistrata, rather than caricaturing any particular Athenian general or politician. And then we get Thesmophoriazusae in April at the city Dionysia, the other festival, and the politics are completely gone. Like, it is just not a good time to be political. So in a sense, Aristophanes almost has to reinvent what he's doing a little bit. He can't rely on his traditional political fare. So what does he do? He goes after this battle of the sexes in this environment that, of course, is extraordinarily chauvinistic, misogynistic. And it's kind of this wall-to-wall sort of locker talk idea of what women get up to and what would happen if women ever had any kind of power. And even the speech at the center that you get from the chorus, it's called the Parabasis, is the sort of formal set piece name. Normally, Aristophanes' chorus, it's step out of character, and they address the audience directly, and they'll often talk about some big political or social issue of the day. And here it's all about the women saying, you men are so crazy. Why do you, there's a total paradox here. You say you don't want us in the house, but then you won't actually let us leave the house, that we're a curse on the household, but you trap us inside, right? And it's all got this kind of sense of, this almost like sort of head patting attitude. We're going to let the women speak for a little while, but in this really safely contained way. And of course, right, all of these women, all of them are played by men, right? So it's a real shift in what Aristophanes has done before, and he's not going to return to this women in power theme for a while. There are fragments of another Thesmophoriazusae that he seems to produce maybe about 10 years later. We know very, very little about it. And then in the 390s, he does a play called Ecclesiazusae, or the Women of the Assembly. And it has some things in common with Thesmophoriazusae. The women all put on fake beards and they vote themselves into power at the local, Athenian assembly. And then you sort of get this fallout of what happens when the women are in charge. And it's got a real kind of utopia, dystopia feel to it, but it's quite interesting. Yeah. Yeah. Sorry, I think I wandered away from some of the things you were saying earlier, but
that is always my goal. Don't worry.
Yeah.
Because we did talk about that a little bit in my episode with Julie, just the sort of exactly where Athens was at the time, because that really, and I wasn't totally aware of it. It's funny. I read it like a number of sections of books on Aristophanes himself, and then also the introduction to this, and somehow seemed to not get a lot of that historical context, which seems so vital and important. But also it's fascinating that it's quite so close. Like, I didn't realize it was even 6 weeks from this coup.
Yeah, it's right on the edge. Like, they've got to see something coming. Yeah.
Well, and what's interesting too is, like, like you're saying, comparatively to Lysistrata, like, there is very little political aspects, but at the same time there are a few little moments kind of peppered in where they talk about tyranny, and so it's almost like he couldn't totally resist. He had to at least toss in little bits of keeping tyranny down, and there's
that's
like a Persian aspect as well.
And we don't know for certain which play was played at which festival, but it's a kind of scholarly consensus that the one that does have some political content is sort of safely, squared away in the January festival. And then this one, Thesmo, which is, sort of, clearer of, this political engagement is put in the late March, early April festival, when there would be visiting dignitaries here to see, but we don't know that for sure. Maybe someday evidence will come to light that, reverses the order, but it seems very unlikely at this point. So we'll just have to keep guessing. So, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'd heard a lot about how that one was at the Lanaya and this one is at the Dionysia. And I didn't think about that being the reason. But it makes sense, and it makes it more interesting to consider why it was at why it was at each festival. Now, remind me, like the comedies, they only did one at each festival, right? It wasn't like the tragedies where they would do 3 and
that's right. Aristophanes does manage to break that rule at least once. In the year 422, there seem to be 2 plays written by Aristophanes, but he seems to cheat by getting a buddy of his to produce another play. So in 422, his play Wasps wins, and it beats out another play by Aristophanes. But yes, it is normally 1 play per comedian per festival. If you get selected, right, there's a whole process, right? There's a magistrate in charge of the festival, and the magistrate chooses who's going to get a chorus, is the official phrase, that you're given a chorus for the festival. And it's up to that person. We don't know what the selection criteria are. Almost certainly there's a kind of political connection element to it, right? It's got to have something to do with who but Aristophanes gets selected a lot. He's extremely popular in the first decade or so of his career, in that he's getting, in the first 7 years, he could perform 14 times, because there's 2 festivals per year, and he gets at least 9 of those slots. And there are actually a couple others that might be up there. So the high estimate is that he gets 12 out of 14.
Oh, wow.
And that suggests that he's getting such popular reception that the magistrates are continually bringing him back.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's really interesting. And it sort of connects to, and I deciding whether it's jumping around too much, but I'm fascinated by his treatment of Euripides, especially in comparison to the frogs, because he really, like in the frogs, it just kind of seems like he sort of, and I know there's kind of commentary around that too, of him kind of picking Euripides because Sophocles had only like just died and it was easier.
Yeah, there's questions about that. But the other thing about Sophocles is it's possible he's just untouchable for a comedian. What we don't know the dates of almost any of Sophocles' plays, but we actually have a pretty comprehensive picture of his political life. So he held a number of political positions and religious positions as well. He held a couple of priestships. And so he's kind of like this super upstanding citizen. He's also seen as this kind of perfect example of the tragedian. And, there might just not be a lot of room for Aristophanes to make fun of that. And so he's kind of boring, right? Whereas Euripides has this reputation of being an iconoclast, and he's innovative, but he breaks with tradition. He's, associated, whether properly or not, with people like Socrates and these weird intellectual sophists, right? And so there's just so much to play with there. And I don't know if you guys, if you've talked yet about, things like the reputation of Euripides as hating women and not believing in the gods. Like those are the kind of 2, sort of reputational pieces that stick to Euripides. And this is our first evidence for them. At the assembly of the women, where they're deciding what to do with Euripides, the first woman gets up and she gives her, speech, and she talks about how Euripides is mistreating women all the time. And then the second woman is really upset because she sells garlands at, religious festivals. And Euripides is going around telling everyone that the gods don't exist. So nobody's buying, garlands for religious festivals anymore. And, both of those claims dog Euripides now for the next 2,000 years. Like you can find, scholarly works in the 20th century that will very confidently talk about Euripides' attitude towards women or gods. And it's really just, keeping this tradition alive. And it's a funny pair of accusations, because they don't really stick if you read the plays of Euripides very carefully. From a comedy perspective, you don't want to talk about, sort of nuanced positions. You want things to be very black and white. And that seems to be what's happening here. But Aristophanes seems to think it's, kind of a slam dunk if you make these two associations about Euripides, and that they'll be accepted wholesale, right?
Yeah. That is what blows my mind the most, and honestly is like why I wanted to look at this play at all, because it has happened to me multiple times where I have commented upon Euripides' use of women because that is why I love him. Like, the women that he writes are real people, and they're complex and flawed and fascinating, and I think the other two tragedians have a couple women like that, but by and large, for me, I find them all in Euripides. Like, Diana is like the only one I like otherwise.
Yeah, it's a real challenge, right? So, I'm not going to say Euripides is, or sorry, I'm going to phrase this. So, Euripides' relationship with his female characters is complicated in some ways. Like, we always have to remember that this is a male poet writing for male actors for a notionally male audience. And, if you took someone like Medea, for instance, as an example, there are readings of Medea that actually suggest that it's Jason who is the tragic figure, right? That he's, this poor guy who was sent on this quest. He did what he had to do to succeed, but he's come back with this woman in tow and these two illegitimate children. And he's done what any sensible Greek man would do. He's found a Greek princess to marry so that he can have legitimate children. And all he's got to do is get rid of this, unreasonable foreign woman who clearly doesn't understand how marriage works. She thinks it's a contract between equals. What the hell is wrong with her? Like, that's not how a modern audience, I think, most of the time is going to understand Medea. But it might actually be how Euripides and his Athenian audience understood that play. Now, at the same time, Medea is an extraordinarily complex character, and the psychology of Medea, as you see her sort of getting closer and closer and closer to this final act of infanticide, which is just about the most horrible thing that anybody has ever done in any Greek tragedy. And that's saying a lot, right? She really has to talk herself into it. And that's part of the tragedy, is that she actually loves these children, and just how much of an effect this has on her, right? So I can sort of see it both ways, right? So, I think Aristophanes is wrong to simply say that he hates women, and, but the relationship there is a little bit more complex. Now, having said all of that, I will also note that Aristophanes never mentions Medea, not once. The only time he mentions the name of Medea, it's in the play. I was looking at this because I was thinking about it this week, but he mentions Medea once in the comedy piece, and he's referencing the tragedy by a guy named Melanthius, who's like a D-list tragedian for whom we have like maybe a few lines survive, kind of like just references to his name. But he doesn't mention Euripides as Medea, which is a really interesting omission. At no point, right? Because both here in this play, right, the women are upset that Euripides is presenting, bad women. They never mention Medea. And there's a passage in Aristophanes' Frogs as well, where Aeschylus tries to take Euripides to task because he presents bad women. And again, Medea doesn't show up there either. He likes to talk about Phaedra. And I'm sure you've talked about Hippolytus on your podcast at other times. But he talks about a very specific version of Phaedra that comes from an earlier play by Euripides, not the Hippolytus play that survives now.
Oh.
And he talks about, sorry, we can go back to that. So the women that he does mention, I was looking at this list.
Yeah.
And the women that he singles out as these bad examples. So Phaedra, who in the play by Euripides that we have that survives, she falls in love with her stepson, Hippolytus, and she tries to hide it, but it's all revealed by the nurse. And Hippolytus is so absolutely disgusted by this, and he threatens to reveal Phaedra's unnatural lust, that she dies by suicide, right? Partway through the play. But that's the second time Euripides has treated that story. There's an original play. We only have fragments of it. We have a hypothesis for it, I think, that tell us what happened. And there it was a Phaedra who was into it, right? That she goes after Hippolytus, right? That she's the adulterous kind of, that, like the cougar kind of thing, right?
Yeah.
That's not actually the right term because she's almost probably the same age as Hippolytus,
yeah, I was
right?
Gonna
because
say that's
the age
important.
difference in the marriage. So I don't know exactly what the right term is for it, but but this woman who is explicitly trying to engage in an adulterous relationship with her husband's son, right? Another woman who gets mentioned is Cenobia. I think she only appears in Frogs. I don't think she appears in Thesmophoriazusae, but very similar situation. She's connected to the story of Bellerophon, who flies away on the Pegasus. And same thing, Bellerophon is staying with her husband, and she gets all lusty for him and goes after him. And then the third figure, and she is mentioned in Thesmo, I think, is Melanippe, who her greatest crime is that she is, you're going to put content warnings, right, on the series, but she's raped by Poseidon, and she has twin sons. And she tries to hide it from her father and ends up being sent into exile. And the twin sons are exposed and raised by another couple. And the wife of that couple then has her own twin sons, and she's jealous of the adopted twin sons. And she tries to get her twin sons to kill the original twin sons. And it doesn't work because they're the sons of Poseidon, so they're stronger. And basically everybody dies. But Melanippe doesn't do anything, right? Like it's really weird that she gets cited as an example of as a bad woman. So there are two plays by Euripides that tell the Melanippe story. And so we have to assume that this is the version of the story that Aristophanes means, and it doesn't make any sense at all. So, I think there are actually maybe some worse women out there that that Aristophanes could use as negative examples here. And he doesn't. And I think, Aristophanes is so frenetic so boisterous in the way that he presents his material that I think there actually are lines that he won't cross, but he crosses so many other lines that you don't really notice that he's pulling back from certain things. So this is something that I was thinking about as I was looking at the women that he talks about as bad women. And Phaedra, okay, she's bad in that first version. He's conveniently ignoring the second version. Cenobia, okay. And then Melanippe shows up, and I'm like, what is going on here? So it's a weird list. It's a weird list.
Well, what interests me about that is that it almost seems like, and I think that this comes through in a lot of the actual like lines critiquing women, is that his complaints about women tend to be things that are like, I mean, maybe it's just his own kind of judgment about what he decides is so bad. Because, I mean, certainly to us today, they would just be like, oh, she's human. Right. Okay. she's human, and she's made a couple mistakes or stuff has happened to her that isn't her fault. Or like Aristophanes feels to me like so much of Greek mythology broadly, which is these ideas of like, if you're raped by a god, it's your fault. It's like Hera going after all of the women instead of the men and stuff like that, right? That's like he just feels to me like that. And one thing Julie brought up too last week is that he was quite conservative in terms of his like him as a person, and that feels very true to me in these moments
Aristophanes was?
where, yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that does seem to be the political or the scholarly consensus. Yeah, that's right. Sorry, go
Mhm.
ahead.
No, I mean, it is feels like that in those moments because his complaints are like, oh, she, had an affair, or she had just like had feelings towards somebody else, or thought about having an affair. Like, it's
Yeah.
really benign stuff. So it just feels like that level of Athenian conservative nature of just, if your wife is not perfectly at home, not seeing a single other person every moment of her life, then she is inherently a bad person. Like, that's what it feels
Yeah.
to me.
What so much of it comes down to, and I like, when I teach this course on comedy, one of the taglines I put in the syllabus description is that you can tell a lot about people by what they laugh at, right?
Mm.
And what really seems to get at Athenian men is the concept of the legitimacy of their children. That seems to be
Mm.
what they obsess over more than absolutely anything else. So almost everything that the women are accused of doing or described as doing in Thesmophoriazusae comes down to some form of theft, right? So they're taking things from the pantry. But what they're really stealing are legitimate children, right? So if
Mhm.
they're having adulterous affairs, they're having babies that don't belong to their husbands, and that's not what wives are for, right? They're for only one thing. And indeed, like that's actually the marriage oath is the father gives the woman to the bride, and he says, I give you this girl for the production of legitimate children. That's the whole marriage oath. There's none of this I do. The
Yeah.
woman has no role except to get on the cart and be rolled away to her new home.
Yeah.
So much of the obsession around this is about the production of legitimate children. And if you look at, the kinsman, or Nasilicus, whichever you're calling him in your
Mhm.
translation, when he gives that absolutely ridiculous speech at the assembly, right? We shouldn't be mad at Euripides for giving a few things away. We do all these other things that, nobody ever talks about. And he escalates, and it's pretty much the last thing that he talks about is baby swapping.
Yeah.
The woman who has a baby and it's not a boy, so they go out and they find a slave who's had a baby boy, and they trade babies, and then they show it to the husband. Oh, looks just like you, right? Even his little pecker is the right shape, right? Which that's not how genetics work, but but yeah, so much of it is that's the obsession there. So
Mhm.
yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting to look at the things he does complain about. And especially when you think about, yeah, how he doesn't mention Medea at all, who, for all that we do see her as like a fascinating, complex character, like, yes, is
Mm-hmm.
obviously the most objectively bad. Like, complex and fascinating aside, she still kills her children and other
Yeah.
people. She's not, she's got some flaws. I love her to the ends of the earth, but I can see why she is objectively bad.
Yeah, and maybe it's just not funny, right?
Yeah, yeah, true.
Men going home from the theater and looking in the pantries and looking in the bedrooms, that's funny, ha ha ha. But like men going home and looking for their dead children, is maybe that's just a bridge too far for even Aristophanes.
Yeah. Well, and what interested me too was the use of the very long passages, sort of somewhat taken right out of the Helen, and sort of
Mm-hmm.
why that would be. Like, when I first read it, I thought, it feels so odd because he's mostly just kind of either directly quoting it or paraphrasing it, but he's not like directly satirizing it, it felt to me. But then
Yep.
Julie did point out also that he picked like the woman that Euripides has talked about, who is, I mean, Helen of all people,
Mm-hmm.
and he made her good. And so, of course, that
Yep.
inherently is the complaint: is he made a woman like Helen good, and so that's inherently, him doing bad things to women broadly. It's so hard to kind of wrap your head around because it's so. I mean, I
Yeah,
love the Helen
yeah,
also.
yeah. But it's also important to note that gambit fails, right?
Mm-hmm.
So in the play, and it sounds like you talked about this with Julie last week, but we
Mm-hmm.
get 4 tragic parodies in a row. We get the Telephus parody, we get the Palamedes parody, then Helen, then Andromeda, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And none of them actually work. They're all rescue themed plays,
Right.
but none of them actually work. And the only time that Euripides is successful in achieving resolution with the women is when he actually just comes and talks to them. And then he gets he comes dressed, as a woman yet again, right? He gets Nasilicus, the kinsman, away from that Scythian archer by using an explicitly comic plot device. They're going to get a flute girl and in trance, right, seduce the Scythian archer, right? And so he's like, oh yeah, me so horny, and he goes off to do his thing. And that's when they get away, is when they use a sexually ribald comic plot, right? But you get 4 tragic plots that don't work.
Right.
And it is interesting that the last 2 are both, based on virtuous women. You're right. Like it's
Mm-hmm.
it's quite a thing. Yeah.
Yeah, well, and really relevant plays as well, because they would have been performed like the year prior, both of them, which is interesting in itself.
That's
He
right.
was able to
Yeah.
kind of
Yeah.
that.
3 of
Yeah.
them, 3 of them are very recent. And then Telephus
Mm-hmm.
is a bit of an outlier in that it's quite
Mm.
old by this point. It's 27 years old.
Oh wow.
But yeah, the Telephus it's a funny one. I think it might actually be Aristophanes' favorite play.
Hmm.
He parodies it a couple of times. He does it in Acharnians, which is the first play that we have that survives from him. So that's in 425. So the play's 13 years old. It's in 438 at the time. That's a little bit
Mm.
old. But
Mm-hmm.
this time around, it's 27 years old. And he doesn't even name the play in the parody. He just kind of expects his audience to know what's going on. But he tells
Mm-hmm.
us, we're going to parody the Palamedes, and we're going to parody the Helen, and we're going to parody the Andromeda. Yeah, no, I've got a theory about the Telephus, and I gave a paper years ago on this at the Greek Drama 5 conference, which was at UBC, but
Hmm.
nobody laughed me out of the room. So, I haven't printed it out yet, but no, if Aristophanes is born somewhere around 450, we don't know precisely, but that's a pretty good guess. It means he's about 12 years old when the Telephus comes out, this play that he parodies a number of times. And my guess is that maybe it's the first time he ever went to the theater, and it's the first
Hmm.
tragedy that he ever saw. And he it just stuck so hard in his brain that he can never quite let it go. And in fact, most of the tragedies that he talks about, so, we've already talked about Melanippe and Sthenobia and the first version of Phaedra. Those are all plays from the 430s. They're all plays from when he's really young, when he's a kid.
Hmm.
And I think he's kind of got this idea of what Greek tragedy is and who Euripides is based on like his teenage years of going to the theater.
That's really interesting. I like that. And I mean, I know Euripides' career is really fascinating too, in that when I covered the Helen last year, I had on Toph Marshall, who talked about how from that time when the Helen and the Andromeda, which I think was
Yep.
412,
Yep, that's right.
he
Yep.
yeah, right. He only had women choruses from that time on.
Mm-hmm.
And that is my favorite thing in the world, and I think about it all of the time. But it feels to me that like there was some kind of progression in Euripides' career, but also in his own like thoughts towards women, and that he became interested in telling their stories in a more like, I think, realistic and like honest and complex kind of way. And it almost feels to me like maybe if Aristophanes, found theater when he was young with those older plays, that maybe he's almost taking issue with the changes in Euripides' attitude and style towards women. And I wonder if that's why he also kind of talks about like the Helen and the Andromeda, who are both, the Andromeda of course is fragmentary, but like the Helen is this complete rewrite of Helen
Yep.
of Sparta and Troy, and making her into this like completely different character who is so much more interesting and sympathetic and just like virtuous and good, and that kind of in itself feels like something that could make a conservative man mad.
Yeah, and if you sort of think of Aristophanes as, a little shit, but a little shit who wants to win prizes at the Lenaea and the Dionysia, I think there's value to him in citing some of these older plays of Euripides, because it kind of sticks in his eye, right? Like, it's kind of a poke in the eye to Euripides to judge him by these plays that he wrote decades ago. But then when you get to things like the Helen and the Andromeda, they have the virtue of not only they seem to have had quite an impact when they came out, but they're recent enough that everyone in the audience is going to very clearly recognize what the parody is and what's being made fun of here, and they're going to have a pretty good idea of the ways in which Aristophanes is manipulating it to get new results, right? So in that sense, he's very crafty in that he wants to do his Telephus parody, but he does that very early. It's the first of these 4 sequences, and then he does the Palamedes very quickly, and then he spends most of his time on that Helen and then the Andromeda parodies, both of which they've got some unique staging things going on. They were probably visually distinctive. I know Toph will have talked about, costuming and, what the set design for Helen might have looked like. Those are things that he loves to talk about. And so they're visually distinctive and easy to parody, but even more important, they're easy for an audience to get. Everything, when we look at the way that Aristophanes structures his plays, even the ones that have kind of deep political engagement. So Wasps, for example, takes on the structure of the judicial system in Athens, which doesn't sound funny, but it actually is. He buries all of that in the first half of the play. And the second half of the play is all about the consequences of this guy running around Athens, basically being a jerk because he's not going to jury duty anymore. And you end with a dance party in which he challenges Carcinus, a Greek tragedian. And again, you get, Aristophanic comedy versus tragedy. But he's very clever at thinking about, the sequencing of things that he does in the play, so that he always ends in ways that will engage the audience more. So if he's got stuff that he wants, but he thinks the audience might not be as into, it comes early in the play. And then when he's got stuff that he thinks the audience will respond to really well, that comes late in the play. And you almost always end with some kind of procession or parade, because it's comedy, right? You got to remember the fun bits. So you put those really fun bits right at the end, right? So if he had reversed those parodies and finishes with the Telephus, some people are going to get that one, but not everyone. Some people are going to be like, oh yeah, he's doing Telephus again, right? But he builds up, and basically everybody in the audience is going to be like, oh yeah, Helen, I was there, I saw that, right? And they're going to have some sense of, a pretty clear sense of what's going on.
That's interesting too, because it also just ends up with it being like I'm sure it's not coincidental, but it's awfully convenient for Aristophanes to be writing this entire play about how Euripides, treats women, and then have the year prior he did 2 plays dedicated to women. And one of the things that came up when I talked to Toph about the Helen is that like these are 2 plays where, I mean, less so with Helen, definitely with Andromeda, where like they're not the most famous people being featured. Like, it's not called the Menelaus. Menelaus is like a bumbling sort of, he's nice, but he's very different from the Iliad Menelaus in the Helen. And then
he's a wiener. Yeah.
Like, I like him because I dislike him in the Iliad, but like he's really odd.
He's the most popular character in Greek tragedy. Nobody else has more appearances than him in our surviving Greek tragedy. I think Orestes has a tie. I think it's both. I think they
Okay.
both appear in 8 different tragedies if you count across what
Wow.
survives, right? Because he's associated with Helen and he's associated with
Yeah.
Agamemnon, and he's a bit of a doofus, but he's a connected doofus, right?
Yeah.
Even in the Odyssey, right? He's gonna go in
Yeah.
book 4. We find out he gets to go and live on the island of the blessed because he's married to Helen. He's a very, very lucky doofus. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I have my own, like, could talk forever also about the Helen
Yep.
and Menelaus of the Odyssey versus the Iliad. But
Yeah.
it's interesting also to have the Andromeda, where it's like you would think it'd be about Perseus, but it's about Andromeda, and it's one of those ones where I desperately wish we had it for that reason, because I'm so interested in
Yeah.
how that
And
comes about. But
really, the best evidence we have for the Andromeda is this play, is the
Mhm.
Thesmophoriazusae. So if you pick up a fragments of Greek tragedy, text, whether it's the Loeb or the Aristophanes Phillips or whatever, right? Almost all of the fragments that we have for this play, it's that dialogue, it's that well, I guess that the
Mm,
monologue that the kinsman initially gives, and then the echo scene, which is a really weird scene. I don't know what
it
Euripides was
is.
thinking there. And
Yeah.
then you get the arrival of Perseus, presumably on the mechane, right, on the
Mhm.
crane. So again, he's saving the Andromeda parody for the end because it's got the most dramatic use of stage machinery of all 4 of them. So it's it's pretty amazing. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So that reminds me of something we talked about or just touched on earlier, but I'm really interested
Yep.
in this idea that Euripides didn't make or wanted people not to believe in the gods, or some that whole realm. Like you were saying that it's introduced in this, which makes sense to me. But is
Mm-hmm.
there anything beyond this? Because to me that also feels kind of wild, because he uses the gods in his plays a lot. Seeming like I find
Yeah.
his use of the gods more interesting than the other tragedians, but he certainly uses them a lot.
He does use them a lot. He never questions their existence. What I think is going on there, again, like as his relationship with women is more complex than what Aristophanes wants to make it out to be, I think it's more complex here too.
Mm-hmm.
So he does have characters who question not the existence of the gods, but the kind of morality of the gods. So the Bellerophon story has Bellerophon flying on Pegasus and mounting an assault on Olympus because he doesn't like what the gods are doing.
Mm.
Even in some of our extant tragedy, so at the end of Bacchae, for example,
Mm.
Cadmus really calls Dionysus to task. This is a really shitty thing you guys are doing to us, and boy, does this punishment not fit the crime. And he's like, yeah, I'm a god, man, like of course it fits the right. So really kind of questioning that kind of ethical behavior of the gods, and in some ways
Mm-hmm.
foreshadowing some of the things that Plato will say about the gods, for example. And he's
Mm.
he famously kicks poetry out of his Republic, and it's partly because they tell stories about gods behaving badly, and that's not a good moral instruction for good citizens. But a lot of it comes back to, now that we've talked about Plato, we can talk about
Mm-hmm.
Socrates.
Mm-hmm.
And Euripides has this reputation for being, he's associated with some of the sophistic intellectuals of his day, especially Socrates, right? And of course, Socrates is going to be executed for corruption of the youth in what year are we in? If we're in 411, yeah, we're actually not that far. We're only 13 years from the execution of Socrates.
Mm.
And of course, Socrates gets mocked by Aristophanes in The Clouds, right, as this clever, sort of sophistic character who believes in false gods all the time, which is the other big accusation that's laid against Socrates. Plato and Socrates both say this is total bullshit, right? So if you look at the Apology by Plato, which is supposed to be Socrates' last speech, he actually calls out the clouds as painting Socrates with this false brush.
Mm.
And Euripides is kind of associated with those guys. And so it becomes kind of an easy target to sort of to paint him with that very broad brush of this guy who's so intellectual that he rejects the traditional gods, right? And that's not what he's doing. At best, he's questioning our relationship with the gods and the morality of the gods, and what that power dynamic means, in ethical terms for us, right? And this goes all the way back, like his play Hippolytus, very much with Aphrodite and Artemis basically playing chess with human characters, and everybody dies because of it. So it's a good modern analogy might actually be, if you think of the concept of wokeness, right, on the internet.
Mm-hmm.
Progressive leftists, they never describe themselves as woke, right? It's, the term is used primarily by, right-wing trolls who are trying to own the libs, as it were, right? And it doesn't really matter that they can't quite define what woke is. And it doesn't really matter that, the value set there, like they don't have to do much to really establish it. They can just use it as a label, right? And it's not about engaging with anybody on the progressive left. It's all about, scoring points with your right-wing audience, right? I think there's a little bit of that here as well, that you just kind of throw this, he's this sophistic intellectual who rejects the gods, and it just puts him in a corner with Socrates, who is also falsely labeled in this way, and some of the other intellectuals of the day. So I think that's probably where that's coming from.
Yeah, it feels almost the same as the issues with women, where it feels like it's more just that he is not in the same vein as the traditional conservative Athenian man, and thus
that's right.
That.
Yeah.
And now it feels like the reason why he's so interesting is all the reasons why he was like getting in trouble back then, or why he was being criticized.
Yeah, and and Euripides, I mean, his relationship with Athens is interesting. He doesn't win very many victories at the city Dionysia when he's alive, but he's allowed to produce plays with increasing frequency. Most of the plays that we have, and most of the titles that survive that we've lost, but we know the dates for, come later in his career rather than earlier. So, when he starts out in 455, he's producing a play, once every 3, 4, 5 years, as far as we can tell. But by the time, a trilogy every 3, 4, 5 years. But in the last sort of 10 to 15 years, he's up almost every year or every other year kind of thing. Like he's producing with much greater frequency, which tells us that somebody out there wants to see plays by Euripides.
Mm-hmm. Because he's so good. God, they're the best. Very grateful for that. I talk a lot about the alphabet plays on my show too, and just how lucky we are to have all of those.
Yep. Yeah. Which again includes Medea, right? Poor Medea, who's so popular today, but she's always excluded. She's a select play. Sorry, no, she's a select play. That's right.
It does include the Helen though, which I think we're
include
very lucky.
That's right. Yeah.
I'm very grateful to have had you on for this as well. I feel like all of this is so important to understanding this play, because me looking at it was just me going like, I don't know how to fully tell you all the horrible things that he's saying. It's very difficult. So this context around it is so important, and it gives Aristophanes a lot more credit, but also just makes it all way more enjoyable.
I mean, Aristophanes he's very, very talented as a player. Like, he's not flawless, right? So when he gets a hold of a joke, he never lets it go. And I think even the ancient audience must have got tired of it at times. There's some joke sequences. I don't know if there are any in Thesmo, but like in Acharnians and a couple of the other plays, Knights, have a couple of sequences where he makes like a kind of pun, and he just kind of keeps repeating it. And you're like, dude, like, let's move on. But he's very, very good at other things. He's extraordinarily good at visual metaphor, even though we don't see a lot of that in Thesmophoriazusae, but taking, abstract ideas and representing them as a visual idea. So Socrates's weird philosophical ideas appear as the chorus of clouds, or in his play about angry jurors, the wasps, and the jurors are depicted as wasps because they move in big groups and they sting and they get angry all the time. And, I've already mentioned, right, the very skillful way that he threads together these two seemingly disparate sort of, competitions, right? Man versus woman, comedy versus tragedy. And it plays out in this extraordinarily, well thought out way. Like it's pretty impressive.
Yeah, I think that's important to note because it is one of those things that's difficult on my end to come through with, just because narrative, trying to turn a comedy play into a narrative is like nearly impossible. I think I'm going to stop trying. But I'm glad to have people on to talk about his plays at the very least. But the one thing that interests me, because talking about it this way, it sounds like his comedy is so smart and interesting, and then it also is sort of, all of that is kind of juxtaposed with his real love of like bathroom humor, for lack of a better word. Like the dick jokes are
That's right,
throughout this play, and like a lot of sort of absurdist kind of comedy as well.
Yep. Yeah, and that's another thing that he does extremely well. So I mentioned earlier, like I've acted in a play of Aristophanes, I've directed, I've produced a couple. And one of the really interesting things about Aristophanes from, a staging perspective, some of the jokes are impossible to sell, but there are so many of them on so many different registers. It's like, if you can land maybe every third joke, the audience is going to be laughing through the whole play, and they're going to remember, they're only going to remember a third of the jokes that they heard, but they're going to like the third that they came away with. And the way that he's very skillfully, like you say, like he can do this complex political satire, he can do this sophisticated literary analysis that you get in Thesmo and Frogs. But throughout the whole time, these guys who are performing this political satire and this literary analysis, their dicks are literally hanging out and swinging around through the whole production. And you get fart jokes, you get sex jokes, you get, right, everything from the most base scatological humor all the way up to the most sophisticated parody and satire. And he just squashes it all in, and it fits in some way. It's actually pretty spectacular. Yeah.
So that brings me to a question I'd had, because it's also interesting. I mean, this is like the ongoing question with all of Greek theater, which is that the idea of staging. So do we know for certain a lot about how he would stage things? Because I've been reading two different translations. Like I quoted the Theateretus on the show, but I've also been reading a lot of the Stephen Halliwell translation. And mostly because it had like endnotes, which were interesting. But they don't seem to agree on much, like in terms of even naming characters and who played what.
So those are all major considerations. So most of what we know about how the plays were staged comes from references to Greek tragedy. So when people actually do talk a little bit about tragedy, like Aristotle talks about it in his Poetics, for example, he always talks about tragedy, and then we have to extrapolate. So a really good example, and you're going to have Toph Marshall on again because this is a thing for him, but tragedy was played with 3 actors and only 3 actors. So if a character walks off the stage and you need if you've got 3 actors and you need a 4th character, one of those actors has to go away, put on a new mask and costume and come back. We don't know if the 3-actor rule holds for comedy. It looks like it doesn't. Like I said, Toph Marshall has some sophisticated arguments about quick changes and about how that's funny. Not everyone will buy that argument. By the time you get to new comedy 100 years later, it's back to being a 3-actor stageable performance. So we don't know. Questions about how many doors are available to Aristophanes is a big question. Every single Greek tragedy that we have can use a single door. This is the palace of Theoclymenus. This is the palace of Agamemnon, or the cave of Philoctetes, or whatever. But a number of tragedies appear to need or repurpose doors. and then we get a play like Thesmo. Where does the Skene come in? It gets used as the house of Agathon at the start, and we roll him out. He gets put away. At some point, the kinsman kind of walks away and comes back to the space, and now it's the space of the women's festival and the Pnyx. But the Scythian archer goes inside somewhere to have his way with the flute girl, and so the stage building, the door has been repurposed in some way. And then the other way that we know about staging is through comedy, because it's so meta-theatrical and self-referential. So there's a lot of open question about how these things were staged. Tragedy appears to have been quite austere, not a lot of props. The costumes would have been elaborate, but fairly singular. And then we get to comedy, which is just an absolute mess of props and sight gags and scene changes all the time and quick changes with characters. It's a very common phenomenon in Aristophanes to have a whole bunch of characters in the second half of your play. And again, I keep bringing up Toph's argument, but his argument is that part of the humor is that the actors have to keep running off to play these new characters. So it's a lot more frenetic, but a lot of what we have to assume, we have to either extrapolate from tragedy or try and kind of figure out, what's going on from the cues in the text, which, that reminds me, you said something else earlier as well. The scripts that we have don't give us character names. All they typically give us is a little, we call it a lemma. It's just a little line that says character change. And so, and this play, Thesmophoriazusae, is a particularly complex one. None of the characters are actually named. We have to figure out who is who. So Euripides, he's mostly easy because people say, hey, Euripides. And Agathon's easy because Aristophanes has probably never had an Agathon mask on stage before. So he wants his audience to know, we're going to the house of Agathon now, get ready, right? So that everybody, when they see the mask, they're not trying to figure out who it is. They immediately start jeering at Agathon or wherever. Nobody ever actually calls the kinsman by his name. So we don't know what his name is actually supposed to be. Some translations will call him Nasilicus because there's a biographical tradition that says Euripides had a father-in-law named Nasilicus. And so sometimes if you've seen that, but then we're in Thesmo, where it gets really confusing is with all the women who talk through the assembly scene. And then when they're trying to track down, the male infiltrator, and then in some of the parodies as well, it's clear that it's a female speaking for the most part, but is it supposed to be the same female that we saw earlier on? So sometimes you get first woman, second woman. There are a couple names like Mika and Cratilla that get said. And so, how many of those lines are actually supposed to be Mika? Is she on stage through all of these scenes, or does she come on just for the assembly and then it's other women who talk? And sometimes we don't even know if it's, the women or Nasilicus or what, if it's some of those really fast banters back and forth. It can be very, very difficult. So it's not uncommon to pick up one translation and you get, one list of characters, and then you get another list of characters in another translation.
It's funny because, this is something I feel like I have grasped in tragedy, and I talk about it on the show all the time, of how stage directions and things like that are all, have to be invented by the translator, or certainly they make really educated guesses on
That's
all
right,
of that stuff. But in comedy, it feels like, I assumed it was the same thing, but it does feel so much more difficult. And so hearing all of these descriptions, it does sound like it was considerably more difficult to figure all of that out.
It would be because, comedy, there's more than just, comedy is more than just the spoken word, right? If there can be all kinds of things that are going on, and it's very clear. We've got lots of little scenes and moments in Aristophanes where it seems pretty clear that Aristophanes thinks that something really funny has happened, and we don't get it. And sometimes maybe we're just missing a reference or we don't understand something. But as often as not, it might be some piece of physical humor that we just don't see, right? And we have to make lots of different inferences about what's going on, right? Sometimes it's really easy, right? When one of the women in Cleisthenes are looking for, trying to prove that Nasilicus is male, and they're chasing his phallus back and forth between his legs, like that's pretty clear and easy to see what's going on. But in other places, we don't know for sure.
Yeah, it's extra interesting, especially if you can't even apply the 3-actor rule. Then it just adds even more questions to that. Whereas that at least like provides some kind of inherent structure in the tragedies that we can usually figure things out. And even, I mean, in a lot of the tragedies, you can usually even figure out who's like the first actor, second actor, third actor.
That's
because
right.
Of all of those things. Yeah, it's all like a puzzle, but it feels like, or at least I feel like I understood the puzzle involved in tragedy, and now
and even if we knew, even if we knew one way or another, comedy does follow the 3-actor rule or it doesn't, right? And we don't know, so we sort of speculate. And then comedy, of course, has so many more characters, right? Aristophanes is so willing to bring a character on for a single scene because it's funny in that single scene, right? And then especially, like I said, towards the end of his plays, we tend to get sort of these frenetic visits from multiple characters. Birds does it, Wasps does it, Acarnians does it, others do as well. And they're all on for like just a few lines, right? And they're running on and off and on and off, and sort of trying to keep track of all of that and infer it all from just what the characters say. And, sometimes it doesn't matter that much, but sometimes it can have interpretive consequences. Some versions of Lysistrata, for example, have her leave much earlier than other versions of Lysistrata or translations of Lysistrata. Whether she's actually on stage for the final party scene or not kind of makes a difference what you think about that character. And some translations will have her come on and deliver some lines. Other translations will assign those lines to somebody else.
Oh, that's really interesting. Yeah, the one that stood out to me most between the two translations I've been looking at is Echo, actually, because in one of them, it has Euripides playing Echo, which seems to me to fit because he played Menelaus and then he plays Perseus later. And then in one of my translations, it's just like echoes on stage. And I just think, what would that mean?
Yeah.
Like, because it doesn't, and like Aristophanes doesn't feel like the type of person to just, I mean, certainly in this play, to just have this character come on who, without any other reasoning, like would have to be the goddess or some form, but that doesn't really make any sense. And that was sort of fascinating to me to question whether it's Echo or Euripides as Echo, and if it's not Euripides or Echo, who is it? And,
actually, I that's a good point. I had never seen a translation that didn't have it as Euripides providing the voice of Echo. And of course, there's all kinds of like, do we actually see who's voicing Echo? Like, we shouldn't,
or is it just an
right?
Echo?
Is just an echo, right? Or do you have Euripides sort of sticking his head around the stage building and kind of looking out and repeating lines, and which is actually pretty funny, right? If that's how it's going, I think you can get a lot of physical humor out of that. I'd never seen a translation that that did it without Euripides, but I think, like, if you look at the text, it doesn't explicitly say. I mean, we know that Euripides has appeared as Menelaus already. We know that he's going to appear as Perseus. So it kind of makes sense that when you've got these extra roles to assign, that it could be Euripides again.
Yeah, I mean, it makes the most sense, because if the whole point of those two parodies is that they're parodying Euripides plays, like if he is appearing as two of the characters, like why would he not be the third? It seems bizarre otherwise. And it might even just be like, this is in the Theodoretus translation, and there's also a lot of formatting issues because it's just on that poetry and translation site. And they have like there's some like flaws on that site, so I'm even wondering whether that's just like missing, because there's a few points where they clearly change lines of somebody, but they haven't actually put the person's name, and it's just clearly
and those, it's a fairly loose translation in some ways as well.
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't mean
Seems
it's
like
not, interesting in some ways, but it does. Yeah. I use some of the poetry and translation courses, pieces in some of my classes,
Mm-hmm.
just because they're free. Right. And
Yeah.
it's good for the students to see different translations, but yeah, it could just be, something missing from the site.
Yeah. Normally, I don't use that one. Like, I'll often look at it for reference because I usually try to use like 2 or 3 translations at least for every
Yep.
time I do a play, since I don't speak ancient or don't know ancient Greek.
Yep.
But with that one specifically, it was very difficult to find accessible copies of this play. So it became like one of the few times I've
Yeah.
had to kind of resort to other things. Yeah.
And I remember I suggested to you the translations of Jeff Henderson, but they
Oh,
are,
did you?
they are expensive to track down. He's got it's a wonderful volume from Routledge, Staging Women, I think it's called, and it's 3 plays of Aristophanes. It's Lysistrata, and it's Thesmophoriazusae, and it's the Women of the Assembly, Ecclesiazusae.
Right.
But it's expensive, and it's the only expensive book that I assign to my Love, Sex, and Death class, because his translation is so good. It's off-putting sometimes because Jeff simply doesn't pull any punches on the language. To give you a good example, again, like, I assigned this text about a year ago to my Love, Sex, and Death class, and I got an email. Even though I always have blanket content warnings, there's a very early on when they first encounter Agathon, Nasilicus calls him the F word. And I don't mean fuck. I mean the homophobic slur that should refer to a bundle of sticks, right? And it kind of comes out of nowhere, right? Like it's just there. It just drops into the middle of this. And this student had, and it was a student who was, who had read Aristophanes before, but they were just really, not prepared to have that word there. And to be honest, I had forgotten that it was in there at that point. But it's exactly the right word to use at that point in the text. It really is a very close approximation of what the original Greek says, which is meant to be a slur. Like it really is. So I really like Jeff's translations for that, because they don't pull those punches and you get a really honest feel. But they're tough to find unless you get the Lobes. He also does the Loeb classical library translations. And I remember seeing him talk once, and he considered a career highlight that he got the Loeb Classical Library to print the word fuck in text, in print. He was so happy about that.
An accomplishment. Yeah, I respect that.
Yeah.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, it's I mean, this play kind of crept up on me in terms of when I was covering it. Normally I can I'm always happy to, I like to buy fancy translations of things. But that's good to know generally. Yeah. Oh, I mean, translation is just so fascinating. That's why I always try to make sure I'm looking at more than one.
It's a good approach, especially with comedy.
Yeah. Well, and any of the tragedies too, because I mean, the language can vary so much in terms of like the kind of the emphasis or just
that's
like the words coming out of it. Yeah, it's important. And also I just find it interesting. Like I prefer that because I get so much more context, and often like I know enough Greek that I can also have questions and then go find it on Perseus and figure out a word myself at the very least. So that's always kind of a thrill.
It's a constant annoyance. Like I said, I guess when we started all of this, like, again, you're right. Like tragedy does engage in wordplay, and there are complex ideas that are being presented. So sometimes, the translation can make a difference. But then when you get with Aristophanes, like it changes so quickly, and comedy relies it's so topical, and even senses of humor, right? Like I remember the first time I ever read this play, it was the Old Penguin translation, and it was clearly written by some British guy in the 1940s or 50s who thought that Cockney was really funny. And so you get like all these weird lines that are like almost impenetrable linguistically. And they just don't make it. Everybody's a bloke, and that's supposed to be funny. And maybe it was in 1950, whatever. But comedy engages in so much colloquialism and slang and topical language that the translations of comedy go stale, or at least Aristophanes. It's different from Menander, whose language is very simple and basic in a lot of ways. Old translations of Menander look pretty much like new translations of Menander, but it's a good idea to look at multiple translations for sure.
Yeah, well, and because my show is something that gets accessed by people who aren't in academia at all, and just anyone who is interested in this, it's also, I think, like, it's important that I do it, but I also talk a lot about translations and the importance, because so often I'll have listeners who are like, I want to read the Odyssey. I'll just pick up this cheap translation at a used bookstore. And I'm like, I mean, I respect your need to do that, but you're probably not going to like it.
I always recommend, that you pick up the book and read a couple of pages in the store. And if you're still reading after 2 pages, then go ahead, grab it, right? There's some older translations of the Odyssey. Lattimore's is still really readable. But you're right. Like, there are some that, are, and even, companies like Amazon repackage old translations and try and sell them for profit. And they might have been composed in like 1810 or something. Yeah. You're just wasting your money. Even if it's not very much money, it's still being wasted. So always read a couple of pages if you're unsure.
Exactly. I think the first one I ever picked up of Iliad or the Odyssey, I don't even remember what the translation was, but I just remember that they didn't Latinize the spellings. And so just like that alone, I was like, okay. I mean, it was like, instead of Achilles, it was like Achilleus with a K and an H. And I'm there like, oh God, this is not the way to get into these works. I was like probably 16 or something,
there can be a place for those translations, but
for sure.
But accessibility can absolutely be an issue, especially in a poem like the Iliad, which is wall to wall long names, right? Yeah,
exactly. Like, I love the Greek spellings, but back before I knew the Greek spellings, I was just looking at this like, oh my God, what am I even reading? Yeah. Well, honestly, this has been so incredibly fascinating. I'm so thrilled to have had you on, because you really added so much to the understanding of this.
Good. Place. I hope so. Right. Like, it's, it's fun for me to do as well. Like, and to get outside of the academy a little bit. Even though I talked about my university classes a lot, but I hope it does bring something. Though. Come take my classes is really the lesson to be learned here. But but this was I know. No, this was super fun to do. I hope it's useful for you. I hope it's useful for your listeners. I'm sorry, Aristophanes is not always everybody's cup of tea, but it is something that's really worth reading, because it's so informative. We have to be very careful about, sort of accepting everything at face value. And we have to recognize, the rampant misogyny. And Aristophanes is obnoxious, but really he's kind of the obnoxious mouthpiece of an obnoxious society. And, it's, and I think about how much my own understanding of antiquity and the ancient Greeks and Romans has changed over the last 20-25 years. And I come from that era. Like, I'm not that old, but I'm getting there, right? And like, we idolized the Greeks and the Romans when I started out, and now I think we do a much better job of contextualizing and understanding exactly what it is that we're talking about. The Greeks are endlessly fascinating, but they were also quite awful in some very fundamental ways. Like, we have made progress, I think, since then. It's always worth keeping in mind. And Aristophanes is one of the ways that we remember that.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. I mean, even like my BA is, somewhere over a decade old. And even that, like, that amount of time everything has changed so much. The way I learned in my classes versus now. And I mean, I'm certainly glad to be kind of like a part of that, especially in terms of sharing it with people who aren't in academia. But it is, it changes so much, and it is especially important in these kind of contexts. So, but I mean, and that's certainly what I talk about all the time, is like the misogyny of it all, but also having the not defense of Aristophanes, but the like just the other ways to appreciate him that I wasn't able to see. So thank you for providing a lot of.
Yep.
Yeah. Well, is there anything you want to share with my listeners in terms of like, do you want them to follow you on Twitter or read anything by you or anything you want to share like that?
I do have a Twitter account. I'm more of a lurker, and Twitter is collapsing these days anyway. Like it's so bad. I'm just watching it burn down.
I know.
No, I don't think I do. I probably should have a better media presence than I do, but go away and actually read some Aristophanes is my advice. Keep in mind that it is going to offend at times, but it also is a window into a different world. And there is stuff there that is still funny, even, once you filter out all the other stuff. But yeah.
Oh, well, thank you. That's wonderful. Oh, nerds. Didn't that conversation make all of the difference? Honestly, I'm just so thrilled to have had these chats, and generally that I get to have conversations all the time anyway, but I say that often. In this case, I think it really turned the whole series around, though. Like, I cannot imagine these episodes without these two conversations. These extra pieces of context and history and biographical information just change everything about how I read the play and how I view Aristophanes. Have I become a convert? No, we're probably going to stay away from him for the foreseeable future. But I do have a different appreciation of the play and what it can add to one's understanding of the ancient world, ancient gender dynamics, ancient Athens specifically. So I'm so thankful to George Kovacs for coming on the show and sharing this knowledge. Like Julie, he volunteered when I tweeted about it, and I didn't realize just how perfectly he aligned with what I wanted to talk about. But I feel like we all just got to sit in on one of those classes that he teaches at Trent, and I'm so grateful. God, this job is fun, even when we're talking about Aristophanes. So that's really saying something. Okay, I'm sorry. I will stop trying to insult that playwright. It's just become like a bit too much fun, Fortunately, though, George was here to defend him and his honor. Let's Talk About Myths Baby is written and produced by me, Liv Albert. Michaela Smith is the Hermes to my Olympians and handles so many podcast-related things except having to read this play. Lucky her. Stephanie Foley works to transcribe the podcast for YouTube captions and accessibility. The podcast is hosted and monetized by iHeartMedia. Help me continue bringing you the world of Greek mythology and the ancient Mediterranean by becoming a patron, where you'll get bonus episodes and more. Visit patreon.com/mythsbaby or click the link in this episode's description. Thank you all so much, you wonderful nerds. Next week, we're going to talk about women in myth rather than comedy. Thank the gods.